Good afternoon and welcome to our UB Alumni Webinar Wednesday series. On behalf of the UB Alumni Association and the UB School of Management, we are delighted you are able to join us for today's presentation. My name is Christy Fields and I oversee the Alumni Career Services program here at UB. Today I am honored to introduce you to Mary Ann Rogers. Mary Ann is a clinical assistant professor with the UB School of Management. She is also a member of the School of Management, Organization and Human Resources and Accounting departments, and principally teaches communication courses on the undergraduate, graduate, and executive MBA levels. Mary Ann is also a visiting professor at the Singapore Institute of Management, where she will be going to teach for summer session 1. Each generation has a collective memory and unique set of values and beliefs, largely shaped by events in their formative years. And in this webinar, you are going to learn how to break through stereotypes and identify generational differences to foster better communication patterns in the workplace. We will leave some time at the end of today's webinar for Q&A. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the chat question box on the gray sidebar of your screen. With that said, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Mary Ann Rogers.
Okay, thanks, Christy. Welcome to everyone. It's a beautiful day in Western New York. I'm not sure where everyone is located, but it's sunny and it's about 80 degrees, so we're off to a really good start. I'm just going to share with you some of the information that I've assembled. This is a topic that I just kind of randomly threw into one of my organizational communication classes, and it really seemed to grab hold. I just needed an extra 10 minutes of filler one day, and it sparked a conversation that really just kind of exploded. And this was with my evening MBA students, who primarily are Gen X, a term that we'll be looking at a little bit more carefully in the next few minutes. But it occurred to me that, there really is something of great interest here. I'll just ask you to keep an open mind. I've assembled a lot of this information from a variety of sources and researchers. It's something that I just kind of keep in the back of my mind on a weekly basis. And when I see an article, I clip it and I kind of just throw it into the content that continues to evolve. It's a bit controversial. Some of the criticism is that it's over-labeled, it's over-generalized, and every generation is seen by the one before it as lazy. So I'll be addressing some of that as well. But it's my hope today that you can at least take away a few different nuggets and maybe start your own thinking process on this in ways that you can bring new ideas into your organization that you would find helpful. So there's a couple of different goals today. I'll just cover them quickly. Goal number 1 is to understand your own view of the workplace and the world and the forces that shape your perspective. The second goal is to develop a framework of generational influences and gain an understanding of how you see others in your workplace. The third goal is to decrease stereotypes and negative judgments and to think more carefully as to how we use labels when we consider others. And then the fourth goal is to really appreciate and embrace the differences that make up our own organization's culture and its own generational tapestry. All right? So, slide is a little sticky there. Let me just get through that. So this is the agenda that we'll be covering throughout the session. We'll begin with the background, again, go into some framing, a little bit of application, and hopefully we'll have enough time for your questions and your comments if you care to put those through. Okay, so some background. A brief history of employment in the U.S. We'll begin with the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution took place from the 18th to the 19th centuries. And it was a period during which predominantly rural societies in Europe and America became industrial and more urban. Industrialization marked a shift to more powered, special purpose machinery, factories, and mass production. While industrialization brought about an increased volume and variety of manufactured goods and an improved standard of living for some, it also resulted in rather grim employment and poor living conditions for the poor and working classes. Moving on then into the progressive era between 1900 and 1917, this is a period of widespread social activism and political reform across the U.S. Its main objectives were to eliminate problems caused by industrialization, urbanization, and a vast amount of corruption that was in the government. So labor unions grew rapidly during this era, and they had a progressive agenda as well. We move into the Roaring Twenties, which was an age of dramatic social and political change. And for the first time, more Americans lived in cities than they did on farms. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929, and this economic growth swept many Americans into an affluent but a rather unfamiliar, what was known as a consumer society. So for the first time in our country's history, people from coast to coast were buying the same products, they were listening to the same music, they did the same dances, and they even used the same slang and types of language. So it became this new urban mass culture. And then, moving into the Great Depression, it lasted from 1929 to 1939, and it was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world. It began after the stock market crash of October 29, which sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the history. Over the next several years, consumer spending and investment dropped, and that caused steep declines in industrial output and employment as failing companies laid off workers. So by 1933, when the Great Depression reached its lowest point, 15 million Americans were unemployed, and nearly half of the country's banks had failed. So certainly a dark time in our history. Just moving forward into FDR's New Deal to get the economy rolling again, the return of government intervention and control in the economy, followed by the American home front, the World War II years. The home front supported the war effort in many ways, including a wide range of volunteer efforts and submitting to government-managed rationing and price controls. And there was a feeling during this time of agreement that the sacrifices for the national good were for the duration. And so the production of durable goods like cars and housing and vacuum cleaners and things like that were banned until the war ended, and prices and wages were controlled. And Americans saved a high portion of their incomes, which led to renewed growth after the war. And this is where, so a little bit of scene setting there, this is where we really get into the heart of our content today. So the history that you just saw and had a chance to think about leads up to where we begin with our generations. And just keep in mind, every generation consists of approximately a 20-year span, divided by genographers and researchers. Every generation has its own unique set of values. Every generation reacts to the generation before it. Sometimes it even rebels against the one before it. And every generation looks at theirs as their own as the standard of comparison, where they, sometimes see themselves as the best in one regard or another. And every generation looks at the next one skeptically as kids today. Okay, so let's just get into the generations at work. And for this discussion, I'm just going to be focusing primarily on baby boomers, Gen X, and Gen Y. And I do have a few notes on Generation Z. I could see that there was some interest in Gen Z from some of the questions that came in prior to the webinar. All right, so let's start with baby boomers, defined as being born between the period of 1946 to 1964. The baby boomers grew up amidst dramatic social change. The events that defined their generation were the Civil Rights Movement, assassinations, space exploration, the Woodstock Music Festival, the Vietnam War. There was post-war optimism, and this generation was really inspired by a sense of prosperity and opportunity. They are used to having hard work recognized and awarded, and they define success as opportunities for career advancement. And so promotions come from hard work, and they're likely not team-based for this particular generation. And also there was a distrust of authority in large systems, kind of a counterculture approach that emerged as the 1960s advanced. And then moving into Gen X, the woman that you see in the center of your screen. Some changes here. So this generation witnessed a number of political and institutional instability. The events of this generation were Watergate, the resignation of President Nixon, the energy crisis, the Challenger disaster. These are the things that took place as this generation was coming of age. Furthermore, this generation was quickly becoming full of children of divorce. So single moms were re-entering the workforce, and things in terms of a societal view, we're changing pretty rapidly. What that meant was a lot of children in this generation became what was known as latchkey children. So they would come home from school, they'd be by themselves because either one or both of their parents were working. They were expected maybe to get siblings off of the bus, get dinner started, and just in general handle things until the real adult in the family was able to come home from work. So this, really has a great influence on how Gen X sees themselves in the workplace. And then finally on this screen, wrapping up with Millennials, also known as Gen Y. This generation, I'm sure you're thinking right along with me, is the most wired generation of all. There has really never been a time when they haven't been exposed to it or when they haven't known technology. And because of that, there's the expectation of immediacy in communication and feedback. It's this instant nature of what Gen Ys expect and how they work. They were raised by boomer parents in many cases who often just, simply had more time and more resources for nurturing. So a little bit different from Gen X in that regard. There's enhanced expectations for recognition, rewards, and attention in the workplace. And they feel as though they have the right to share their opinions readily, and they do expect to be heard. This is, the nature of how they grew up. They were used to getting that kind of attention. They were used to being listened to and having their opinions heard. They will change jobs rather than work for a promotion. And this is something that emerges in my classroom time and time again, because I ask this question several times every semester. Would you plan on staying in the same place for the rest of your life? And the answer is usually just a resounding no. To me, I'm just on the cusp of Gen X, between Boomer and Gen X, and it just seems unfathomable to land a job, a well-paying job in a good organization, and to think about leaving if there's some sort of unhappiness or feeling of unfulfillment. There's just no hesitation that this generation really will leave and go on to the next thing. So there's just some striking differences. If you, I'm not sure who's on the webinar, but if you have nieces and young people around you and Gen Ys around you, this is a very, very real theme that I hear over and over again. And I'll just ask you to reflect on this as well. Okay, there are now 5 generations in the workplace. This is a graph that shows us between 2005 and 2020. So demographers sometimes argue about when a generation starts. It's understood for the model that we're seeing here, Gen 2020, also known as Generation Z, are those born after the year 2000. There's some researchers that also put the front end of that in the mid-90s, but it's somewhere generally in that area. So the thing about Gen Z, also known as post-millennials or Gen Z, they amplify many of the traits that are associated with Gen Yers. So it's still a little early to predicting what the trends are going to look like, maybe what the behaviors are going to be like in general. It feels like it's going to be an amplification of what's going on with Gen Y, so just more of it, maybe on a more intense level. They're growing up even more connected than Gen Y. They are even more reliant on mobile devices. They're more focused on visual media, and they're very much accustomed to collaborative platforms. So some Gen Z have already entered the workforce. Within 5 to 10 years, they'll likely comprise up to 10% of it. And so members of each generation, particularly those in the workforce, face stereotypes that are developed by members of other generations. And the way that what the research is showing us now is, same thing. Gen Zs are seen as being as lazy, self-centered, easily distracted, etc. When I bring this up with my undergraduates, I teach junior accounting students, and they are about 19 or 20 years old. And this sentiment comes out all the time. It's already starting. My juniors will say, well, when we were kids, we had to go outside and play all the time. We were always outside on the street, improvising, playing hockey, whatever. Gen Z seems to be on the couch all the time, in dark rooms playing video games. And, they're just lazy and they don't move. So, again, these stereotypes persist, and it's just the nature of one generation really looking at another. Okay. A quick slide, labor force composition by generation. You can just see a breakdown. This data was from 2015, so it's pretty recent. No real surprise. You see millennials gaining ground in terms of the percentages. Working in different fields, no surprise because the top part of the bar just ages out. All right. So right now, millennials comprise about 34%. Gen Xers about 34%, with a little bit of Gen Z creeping in there at the end. Okay, some of these slides are sticking a little. So I think what we really want to get into here is that every generation has its own attitudes, behaviors, habits, and motivational buttons. This is an overview of some buttons for the three generations that you see on the screen. So looking at baby boomers, the money habits, this generation started to really use credit cards, buying things now and paying for it later, an evolution there, and the way that, I don't know if it's an evolution, but certainly a change in how money was handled and managed. With Gen X, we see that there's a priority on caution and saving, and millennials are earning to spend. Baby boomers, the generation before them saw education as a dream, something that they probably would not be able to achieve. When boomers came on the scene, it began to be understood that it was a birthright, that just so many had a chance to actually go to colleges because state institutions opened up and education just got to be a lot more accessible. Gen X they saw education as something important, a way just to get someplace, just to get into a job, a way to get their life started. Millennials see it as a necessary evil and also an incredible expense, and it is. I see it every day, the fees and the cost of textbooks, and aside from tuition, just how much it costs to really come through school. The family structure, on your screen you see disintegration under baby boomers. What that means is that, for the first time, children were moving away from their parents. They were moving to other parts of the country. They were leaving the city and moving out into the suburbs. So you saw a bit of a breakdown of the nuclear family in terms of its structure and where people lived. Gen Xers with their latchkey pattern and millennials experiencing what's known as merged families. So children of divorces, children of parents who are getting remarried, blending families, having stepsisters and stepbrothers and so forth, and learning how to adapt and kind of cope with changes of that nature. All right, so this, in a nutshell, are attitudes and buttons and so forth. Let me just move on. So how does this really kind of manifest itself into the workplace? Here's a graph that you can see, and here we're just looking specifically at boomers. What do they want from work? Financial security, good benefits, good educations that are interesting, ways that they can use their education and experience, and a company that's ethical. What makes them uncomfortable is feeling dissed by other generations feeling like they're just simply too old and maybe out of the loop a little bit, lack of openness and closed-mindedness, bureaucracy. They will stay in a company if they feel like they are genuinely making a difference and if they find their work to be genuinely interesting. They'll leave if they're feeling undervalued or, again, dismissed by younger generations. They'll leave if they just simply become burned out. And if they don't really feel like they're making a strong contribution, those are the triggers that pretty much encourage this generation to walk out the door. All right, Gen X, what they want from work. Now think about, again, in generalizations, how this generation grew up, the independent nature of handling themselves, of maybe running the household at certain times. So what they really want from work is work-life balance, and they want adaptability. They want opportunities for development, and they embrace state-of-the-art technology. They will stay if they have autonomy and a good schedule and time for time off and opportunities for development. All right, what makes them uncomfortable? Labels, rigidity, being left out of the loop, being hovered over, being micromanaged, although I guess everyone probably really dislikes that. But again, the independent nature of a Gen X can really make this a problem if they feel like they are being managed too closely. They will leave if they don't have an ability to get ahead without becoming a manager, say? Are there other pathways that they can gain? And if not, they will leave. Also, high stress often causes this generation to leave as well. So they're motivated by their independence. They like seeing work impact the bottom line. They like involvement and variety. All right, let's just take a look at millennials. So, a different part of the generation very much want to be included, very much want to have their ideas listened to and used. They expect very clear expectations. There's a dislike of ambiguity. They like being able to make a difference with bright and creative people. And what else do they want? Fun, good salary, diversity, etc. What makes them uncomfortable? Managers threatened by tech, cynical people. A lack of feedback is a big one. If you work with millennials, and I'm sure that we have some on the line too, but if you work with millennials, that this feedback, this notion of getting information and feedback is very much a real consideration. Dislike of inconsistency and disorganization, and motivated by, again, inclusion, attention, and praise, feeling safe and feeling connected in their workplace environment. All right, so I always say it's every generation's job to annoy the one before it. We certainly annoyed the one before ours, no question about it. So let's take a look, though, at how overgeneralizing and stereotyping this way can really have a negative effect on the dynamics that you find around your workplace. Okay, some of my slides are a little sticky, I don't know why. So baby boomers see Gen Xers as slackers, too challenging, and generally not good team players. Baby boomers see millennials as inexperienced, overconfident, and overly competitive. Okay, so here's where you can really start to see some of the negative dynamics that can arise. People really not taking the time to understand people in their workplace and exercising some care and getting to know people. It's very easy to throw different parts of generations into buckets like this. Gen Xers typically see boomers as overly ambitious, rigid and judgmental, not walking the talk. So more of an attitude of, do as I say and not as I do. A lot of, lecturing from the top, if you will. And Gen Xers see millennials as too naive, overly optimistic, and unfocused. Millennials, Gen Ys, see boomers as too serious, wrapped up in the job, lecturing too much, and they see Xers as cynical, unwilling to listen to ideas, not inclusive, and holding standards that are just too high to meet. Okay. So if we take a look again at our three generations, this is where we can really start to make some decisions and really start to think about how we can craft approaches to getting the best work out of people. I like this slide a lot. It's just a really good overview of how generations see the world. So baby boomers, in terms of their behavior, challenge the rules. Xers change the rules. Millennials want to create the rules. So a few different objectives there in terms of what they want to accomplish in the workplace and how they want to use their talents. If you look specifically, so learning style, communication style, problem solving, decision making, and leadership style. If you look in the millennials column, there's very much an expectation that they will be working on those things together with others. Maybe their bosses, maybe their coworkers, maybe people from different parts of the organization. But it's very, very striking, and I think that's probably where most of the value of this particular slide comes from, because there's just this undeniable need and expectation to be highly networked and highly collaborative. If you look back under the boomers, on the other end of the spectrum, it's pretty much a solo show. So learning style facilitated, communication style guarded. So, you don't have to be a genius to see where differences in work styles come in, and where, frankly, some clashes can come in, especially when dealing with communication issues. All right. So here's a workplace scenario, and it's it's a little staged, but I think you can probably get some value out of it. So we have Fred. Fred dreads having to face the quarterly account coverage scheduling. Why do I have to make the case for stepping up to the work over and over again, he thinks to himself. Every month, Fred struggles to keep everyone happy with their hours and commitments. If he hears whatever one more time from his team of entry-level employees, he is going to scream. These 20-somethings don't seem to see that there is a ton of work to get done and everyone needs to give 120% effort. Even when he tries to get them motivated with a passionate pep talk, they just don't seem to respond. So Fred's new boss, Leo, is in his early 30s and can't understand why the results from Fred's team are so average. Given the creative people you have, why can't you figure this out, Leo asked him. As a baby boomer, Fred is feeling like a fish out of water. He seems unable to have his boss or his team get what should happen. Everyone simply has to work harder, sacrifice some of their weekends, and forget about always being creative. So you have a baby boomer manager who's a little fed up, who really is not understanding why he can't get cooperation from a very young team. So he's leading with what's known as legitimate power, and that's a hard power base. You know, if you ask someone to do something in the workplace, they really should do it. You know, just by the nature of your authority, you're asking something for someone, they should turn it around. We also teach in our school that that's the least optimal way to remain a boss, especially in the long term. It's much better to lead from a position of expert power, where you're really good at something, or referent power, where you're just respected for a variety of reasons, and people will want to do things because they like and respect their manager. We don't have that going on here. But anyway, all right, so Leo is in his early 30s. We can assume that Leo is a Gen Xer. If we were doing this in a live session, I'm sure that there would be tons of ideas coming from the floor. Okay, you know, what is Fred missing? And I have run this a couple of times in live sessions, and the ideas are almost infinite. You know, why wouldn't Fred sit down and get some input from the Gen Ys that he's supervising? Maybe there are shortcuts that can be taken if they implement tech more fully, and certainly why Gen Y would have a lot more good ideas on how to maybe achieve better goals through that particular set of channels. Maybe they can move into flexible hours. Maybe they can move into refining the work process in a way that's just a lot more attractive to Gen Ys. All right, so, you know, again, it's just a very, very basic mini case, but it's the type of thing, it's the type of tensions that organizations do feel that they really do want to understand how to, you know, how to tackle this and how to do something helpful about it. I'll just go into something that we teach in our School of Management, and the mini case that you had on your screen a second ago had to do with millennials, but this advice goes for everyone. Effective managerial behaviors, regardless of what generation is being supervised or really anything, comes down to 5 basic tenets. You see them on your screen. So leadership, Fred could just simply provide more structure, maybe be a better role model, have more patience in teaching and coaching and spending time getting to know these young men and women that are on his workforce. Certainly communication, providing regular feedback is something that is really craved by the millennial generation. Keeping the door open, walking around, keeping them in the loop, all those things that, you know, let's face it, take extra effort and time, but pay wonderful dividends if done often and if done correctly. You could challenge them, encourage with guidelines, show them how their work is really making a difference, provide learning opportunities, let them get involved in other areas of the organization, let them really learn and really push them. And certainly respect, certainly a necessary component in any environment. Be listening thoughtfully to ideas, and furthermore, involve this generation in making decisions. You saw in that model that we had up a couple of minutes ago, being part of the decision-making process is huge. It's expected. Give them some creative freedom. Let them make mistakes if they have to. Sometimes the best ideas come out of a mistake. And then the work environment, what could be done there? Looking at work-life balance, you know, Gen Y, I see it because my students, again, are Gen Y, they send me email between 1 in the morning and 5 in the morning. They're up working in the middle of the night, and they're probably turning out their best work. That's when their energy is high. That's when their creativity is high. So maybe shift some of the work into a different part of the day that would just make time management more meaningful for this generation, I think would be a good idea. Flexible schedules, part-time schedules, job sharing, things of that nature, and a real emphasis on being inclusive rather than exclusive. And that's certainly an area where the baby boomer generation and Gen Y can really have some profound differences. All right. Now, Fred is overseeing a team of millennials. So what can he do there? And specifically for millennials, there are some pieces of very good advice that managers can use within this context. Again, consistent constructive feedback. Millennials need to hear often how they're doing in their jobs, and they need clear direction on how to improve their performance. Another consideration is they might take negative feedback personally and have a low tolerance for working through their mistakes. So some training there, some understanding about how the nature of feedback works, that we always say feedback really is a gift. If someone is taking the time to carefully explain what's not going well, and just getting them over that hurdle of not seeing themselves as being bad employees, but just learning how to really accept good, constructive, thoughtful feedback. Also, rewarding performance and productivity instead of, say, just years spent on the job is always a good step. Offering opportunities to change jobs without changing the employer. So are there places in the organization where these employees can move laterally to build their skills? Can they do a round robin? Would there be a kind of training program where certain employees just get to see all parts of the organization and maybe get to sample all parts of the organization? These things do cost money, and they're time and labor intensive. We do realize that. But for some companies, these are ideas that work really beautifully and really help job satisfaction and morale. Also thinking about millennials, help them learn, again, keep them challenged. They will leave their jobs in search of the next exciting challenge. So, really keeping them engaged is a priority. Pair them with older mentors who can teach them business, and then invite Gen Y to perhaps share more of their knowledge with mentors who are less technological savvy. In a formal sense, set up a formal mentor program where you pair people together and share the strengths and the knowledge that they have with one another. It's a real bridge from one part of the generation to the other. Help them learn interpersonal skills for the workplace. This is a big one. I teach communication, and this stares me in the face just about every day. Millennials are really comfortable communicating through their devices. And what we're starting to see is that they need more training in verbalizing their ideas, overcoming verbal apprehension, looking someone in the eye, and having a good, strong face-to-face conversation. This seems to be a skill that is evaporating due to the use of technology and, just quite simply the way that millennials communicate with each other. So these are very, very real considerations. These are concrete things that can be identified and addressed, and let's even say fixed if there's some remedial help that needs to be involved there. All right, and then finally, I'll just move into the last piece of this. Of course, I know everyone on the line knows this, but keep in mind that it's easy to overgeneralize some of these differences. Some of them are just quite simply hyped or overblown. You see the way that they're portrayed in popular culture, really to the extreme. There's a counter article that the Harvard Business Review ran, I think it was about a year and a half ago now, and it pretty much, the authors refused to buy into anything that I've just been talking about for the last half hour, that every generation wants the same, that maybe a mistake is to really separate and define these things too strictly, because everyone wants to be valued, everyone wants to be heard, everyone wants good promotions, and everyone generally wants the same thing. It's just that when people are younger, they have different stumbles and they have more learning curves, of course, just like the way I did and some of you on the line did. So appreciating, and I think that this is really where the value of this particular talk comes from. What does that mean? So focusing on individuals and their professional goals, and this tip spans nearly in all communication. All people want to be recognized and respected for who they are on an individual level. So learning more about them and taking the time to do that, learning more about their goals and their interests is really just the best way to understand them. Recognize the similarities across the generations, what I was just talking about a moment ago. Members of various generations have far more similarities than differences in the workplace. Members of every generation are fairly aligned in what they consider the most important aspects of workplace cultures. Members of each generation rank fairness, being ethical, and being straightforward as the most important aspects of workplace culture. And they also expect virtually the same traits of all their leaders. We want people who are credible, good listeners, forward-thinking, and supportive. And then finally, pay attention to preferred approaches when communicating. Members of various generations grew up with different communication patterns that they carry throughout their lives. And we do this, I think, even subconsciously. Communication technologies are just used differently by each generational group. But beyond technology, members of various generations may differ in a variety of ways. The word choices, the way that they take turns in meetings, the use of humor, their choice of humor, and then many others. So that is a pretty brief overview. Just a couple of sources here, and a special thanks to Krista Glenn at ABC Omega, who helped furnish some of the historical data. Thank you, Krista. I'm grateful to you. And why don't we have a few minutes left, which is good. Why don't we aim to take a couple of questions?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marianne. One of the questions that have come through, can you possibly expand a little bit more on Generation Z and how higher education is adapting to prepare this generation for the workplace?
Okay. Again, this is just kind of emerging. The thoughts on this are emerging. There's some debate among people that are really experts on these issues. I can tell you what I've gathered over the last couple of weeks. And again, a lot of Gen Y's features, more fragmented in terms of media use and just a lot more involvement in technology. So I was reading a report, and the report recommended that higher education policy makers will need to primarily address innovation, financial literacy, outcomes, accessibility, and affordability of higher education. These are very real concerns. If you have children, you know what I'm talking about. It was certainly different from when I went through the University at Buffalo. It was really almost free to go through here. Now, we do have some free tuition plans on the table. We'll have to see how that all pans out. But by and large, for people around the country, these are the trends that we're thinking about. So it's the advice that higher education think about ways of encouraging entrepreneurship, helping institutions develop innovation systems that can give students entrepreneurial skills. That really does seem to be the wave of the future for them from what we can see now. Help them understand financial literacy, help them understand repayment, and thinking about how to develop programs to help students understand their options for managing their student loans, buying their own groceries. This is something that I really do think should be in every undergraduate curriculum. I see my students struggle with this terribly. Managing money and planning money are really big concerns. Having them really think about what their jobs will look like, so certainly focusing on post-graduation employment, of course, but also how students can best persist and complete their degrees. Are there other experiential learning opportunities that we can open for them? And how can we really put them on a path so that they can truly achieve career satisfaction and success? So that's kind of like, in a very broad view, the themes that are being looked at in higher ed as they're looking forward and figuring out how to gear up for this. I did find something that I'm just going to read to you. This is a Barnes & Noble study. It's very quick, but and this came out about a year and a half ago as well, I think. So Barnes & Noble claimed that Gen Z students are making decisions differently than previous generations. The percentage of teens relying heavily on their parents for college advice is 48%, compared to Gen Y's 55%. So instead, they rely more on peers to give them unfiltered, transparent information. Gen Zers are highly skeptical and will quickly fact-check the authenticity of marketing efforts. Colleges are recognizing this trend by cutting down on flashy advertising and providing prospective students with more opportunities to talk to current students. Although parents are still important, marketing may not be directed as strongly towards them. So I just thought that was an interesting shift on how we recruit students as well, which is certainly a big concern here at the University at Buffalo.
Wonderful. That's great, Marianne. Just another question, too, that has come through. Can you address the strengths that diversity in collective memory and unique set of values and beliefs bring to organizations?
Okay. That is, I think, a really beautiful question. And again, looking at this from a macro view, it's not any stretch whatsoever to say that companies that are more generationally diverse are stronger in a lot of ways. A couple of things. So a workforce that's composed of different age demographics just creates an environment where each generation brings different skills and talents to the table. And this is, if the company is being managed right and if there's opportunities for this kind of interaction to handle. For example, like more mature professionals often have exceptional interpersonal skills and perform well in environments where traditional in-person communication is used. So there's a diverse range of skill sets in an organization, and it can really offer an advantage to a company that caters to a multi-generational demographic. You can say things like various viewpoints from different generations very much help with decision making. Every generation has a different mindset. And again, those influences that we saw. So different mindsets in approaching a problem. And so when all the generations are present in one place, the organization really does tend to receive various viewpoints, which help them make clearer and better decisions. Another thing that I think is interesting is different generations in the workforce can actually allow an organization to work around the clock. It's a big advantage. If a boomer strongly believes in like a 9-to-5 shift, but other generations like to work different hours, it's completely understandable that you can pretty much keep your organization open 24/7 if you do have these kinds of generational resources, and if it's a priority of the firm, certainly to stay open, that would be a consideration. But there's just a lot more flexibility when you look at the workforce through this lens. And then and when it comes to traditions, I guess younger generations are credited with having good working knowledge of business technology, and more mature members of a workforce have the advantage of traditional business skills. And this kind of diversity gives businesses the advantage of being able to communicate and deal with customers across all age spectrums. And I always really like this example. You can understand that maybe one customer might prefer the fast pace of an email correspondence, while another might appreciate the tradition of a good old-fashioned formal business letter. And a diverse workforce can cater to both kinds of these customers. I would like to get back again just to the notion of mentoring, because there's just so much strength in that idea, and it's something that we see be successful across many, many types of workplaces. And so if you have this mixed-aged workforce where companies value the knowledge and the experience and the skill above age and seniority and gender, so if you have this value, knowledge and experience and skill, employees of all ages have the opportunity to teach, share, and learn from one another. And I hope that everyone on this call is in an environment like that. I've seen several. My family's in business, and they have that going on there, and it's really quite impressive. It just breaks down those barriers. You can even put cross generations on teams and so forth, and there's just a lot of value that comes out of that. Yeah, and just continuity. Traditionally, older workers train younger professionals in the ways of the company. They pass down accumulated years of experience. And if you have a place that's just made up, if it's dominated by young professionals, it can go out of business. There's really, no place to hand it down to. And in a workforce that's dominated only by mature employees, they retire and they can actually put the business out of business. So there's many, many advantages to thinking about this with an open mind and thinking about how you can thread some of these ideas through your own organization.
Really great advice. Thank you so much, Marianne. Another question to think about. One of our attendees noticed on the percentages of generations in the workplace slides early on, the Gen X portion was low as compared to the Boomer and Gen Y, no matter what time period. Do you have some idea maybe as to why this is? Maybe the percent of the population, or maybe some other reasons Gen Xers aren't working as much as some of the other generations?
I do. I'm going to unhide a slide that I didn't like. If you don't, can everyone see the slide? Demographics? Did that come up, Krista?
It sure did, yes.
Okay, good. All right. So if you would just ignore the numbers, it's not the most beautiful looking slide. But what happened was, you see the baby boom era here defined between 1945 and 64. What followed was a baby bust, where the number of births declined dramatically, as you can see from the graph. And if you search on the web for other versions of this, other data sources of this, you'll see that the story plays out over and over. It's not one person's interpretation. It's just the way that the numbers appear. What happened after that, Gen Y is also known as echo boom. So the echo of the baby boomers' kids brought the numbers up again. So there's simply more people of that generation alive in the U.S., and that's why the number is reflected in the workforce. That's an excellent question. That's an excellent catch. I'm getting into some. This is the slide, right? Or this is the slide. Yes. So that is why you see that particular trend in the workplace, that there's just simply less people in that demographic.
Excellent, thank you. And then another question too, is there a way to match generations to career paths? For example, since Gen Xers are used to being in charge from an early age, would they be happier in a career path like business ownership? Any ideas or suggestions or feedback there?
It does look like it's, and this is, I don't have research at my fingertips, I just know what I see from spending so much time in the business school. What's being requested in our programs is a lot more entrepreneurship programs, a lot more self-managed kinds of things. And so it feels like, if we look at it coming from the inside out, there's a lot more of that kind of activity around us. We have an entity called Blackstone Launchpad, where our students can take their ideas and get help developing them. There's a lot more requests for like competitions that can help them launch their ideas and so forth. I'd like to work on this question and get back to the participant. I can take a look. I'm sure that there's some data and some publication on this of how to best maybe even help a young person determine how they can really channel and apply the skills that they have into, like a defined job path. I'm certain there must be something like that. I just haven't really spent any time looking at that, but I will be happy to do that.
Marianne, this has been such great information and research that you have shared, and we are all just so grateful for the time that you've spent with us today. So I just want to say on behalf of the UB Alumni Association and the UB School of Management, really a big thank you for taking time to share your knowledge, share this information, and all of your expertise. If any additional questions do come through, we will be happy to work with Marianne and get you those answers, and we will email the group or the individuals those responses as well. We will also send you the recording of this webinar within the next 24 hours, so please be on the lookout for that. And then we also want you to save the date for next Wednesday, May 24th. UB alumnus and our very first international presenter, AJ Hatungdi, will present on venture debt. And AJ is the Chief Executive Officer responsible for leading Innoven Capital's business in India. And then in addition, AJ also serves as the Chief Operating Officer for Innoven Capital Group, where he has responsibility for developing strategy for the group, as well as setting up the group's business in new markets, which include Southeast Asia and China. And AJ is considered to be a pioneer in starting the venture debt industry in India, which is a key global hub of innovation and venture capital. So we hope you're able to join us next Wednesday as well. And then in addition, we do have some upcoming webinars in the months of May and June on the following topics. We're going to have an alum talk about due diligence for business, plus some Google Ninja tricks. we have an alum who's going to talk about the art of persuasion in sales and life. And then we're going to dig a little deeper into professionalism and talk with an alum who has written a book, and she's going to share some insight and information on that as well. So with all of that said, once again, we will share all questions that come through after this webinar with Marianne. If you'd like to reach out to her directly too, I know she has her email address there as well. And with that said, thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you, Christy.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.